So what we're going to talk about is some of the basics of APA, how to know what's going to work, what's not going to work, just familiarize yourselves with some of it, and then we're going to go through and we're going to do a few examples. I'm going to show you some up on the screen, and then I'm going to give everybody a chance to sort of use a resource. What we use at this school here is the Little Seagull Handbook, so I have 2 copies of that, and you'll be able to use that to sort of document one of the sources that we have up here, just so that you can kind of familiarize yourself with how to use the references, because sometimes that's half the battle, figuring out where things go. So what you noticed about the screen before was that it was set up like a living room, and the theme of this particular discussion is that it's like arranging a living room. Essentially, every piece in APA has its own particular space, and so you just have to sort of be able to identify those pieces and then follow the directive of a reference tool like either the Little Seagull Handbook, the Purdue OWL website, the APA publication manual, or whatever other resource or format that you want to use. So some very basic things is that APA stands for the American Psychological Association, but what you'll recognize, and most of you aren't in psychology, is that even though you are not necessarily a psychologist, you're still going to use it in your field. And part of that's because APA has been kind of deemed as the professional style. So if you're looking at scholarly and peer-reviewed journals, especially ones that are experiment-based or research-based, they're going to be in APA format because that's the expectation in that professional field. So what characterizes APA is that it has 2 key parts. It has an in-text citation, which will appear in parentheses, and we'll look at some different examples and some different scenarios for how those can be adjusted a little bit. And then it also has a complete reference, where if you've used MLA before, which is probably what most of you have used, MLA uses what's called a works cited page. It's pretty similar for what APA does, but they call it a references page. So it's important to make that distinction, and what we're going to find with APA is regardless of what your frame of reference is, it's all about knowing sort of the little ins and outs and individual quirks of APA in order to be successful with implementing it. So like I said before, it's commonly employed in the social sciences. It's a professional style, but if you're in radiography, education, nursing, business, criminology, you're going to find that you're using APA pretty frequently. So some things that you're going to need to know as far as laying out your paper is how to format the cover page, how to do an abstract depending upon the type of research or the type of paper that you're writing. If you're writing a standard, 2 to 3 or 5 to 7 page paper, something that's not research based or something that's not experiment based, you're likely not going to have to use an abstract, but it's one of those things that you always want to clarify for what the particular professor is looking for, because even in some of those shorter assignments, professors are still going to want that abstract. It always is sort of dependent upon that faculty member. Now within the body text, you're going to have it broken up into subsections, and for those you'll use different headers. So it'll change the formatting or the style of the font, and also which type of indenting it gets, or whether it's centered or that sort of thing. And like I said, the final page is going to be your references, and that's where the complete documentation for a particular source will be found. So each in-text citation needs to include at least 2 things. It always needs to have an author's name, and it always needs to have a year. Now the exception to that rule is that, or the addition to that rule I would say, is that if you take a direct quote, a word for word, quotation from a particular source, then you need to add the page number that goes along with it. Where do you think you might not need the author's name, or where would you include something other than the author's name?
Already given like a leading statement, like saying according to Smith, this happened.
So yeah, maybe if you use what's called a signal phrase, and we'll look at some examples of that. What's another source that you might use though that would be difficult to find an author, or sometimes you just can't find one at all?
The title. You use the title.
Yeah, you could use the title, but what I'm thinking of is if you're using a web-based source, often websites are not very good about including the author's name, or sometimes they're published on behalf of a corporation or organization, and so sometimes you need to find something a little bit different. Now, the good rule of thumb to remember with these in-text citations is that whatever appears first on your references page is also what should appear first in your in-text citation. So if you can't find an author, you sort of move down that chain of command, and then likewise that should transfer into your in-text citation. The ultimate goal here is that the in-text citation is supposed to be a quick tool so that if you flip to your reference page, you can find the complete source, and then if your professor wants to pursue it, they can find the actual article that you used. And it's not necessarily to say that you plagiarized, but maybe to figure out if you interpreted that article or that source correctly, they may want to go and read the full context of the argument that you're drawing from that particular source. So it may actually be to help you make your argument, a little bit more airtight or a little bit more secure. So the important thing to keep in mind with APA is that paraphrasing is preferred to direct quote. Now, in a professional style, why do you think it's better to have something in your own words rather than to sort of copy and paste from someone else?
Because it shows that you understand.
Right, exactly. It's your way to illustrate your level of understanding not only of previous sources, but how they relate to whatever argument or whatever type of research you're trying to present yourself. So it's important as a professional to be able to articulate your ideas, and APA reinforces that by kind of putting a greater stress or a greater emphasis on the paraphrase as opposed to the direct quote. So it is a good way to demonstrate your understanding of a concept. Now, like I said, there are two main methods for citing your sources in the text. Robert mentioned one earlier, which is the signal phrase. So that would be something like according to Smith, or Smith 2008 says. So that would be an example of a signal phrase. Now the other option is when you don't reference the author, in which case the author's name will need to appear at the end of the sentence in parentheses, and it will need the author, comma, year. Now I know it all sounds kind of nitpicky to say, well, you need the author, then you need the comma, then you need the year, then you need to close your parentheses, then you need a period. But every piece has its appropriate place, and literally if you miss one, it makes the citation incorrect. So it is sort of a tedious or detail-oriented process, but it's one that makes the difference. And what I like to tell students is that there's really no excuse to lose points for citations because it's just following a formula. So there's no real excuse to miss those elements. So let's see if we can take a look at a few different examples here. So what we'll look at when we see this one here is we'll see that the author's name is listed in the sentence. And what you see is actually taken directly from the Little Seagull Handbook. The examples are meant to line up, and as we go forward and we look at the breakdown for books and journals, you're going to notice that they're color coordinated to coincide with the Little Seagull, just because I want your brain to sort of process things the way that you're going to be expected to do it when you actually use that reference. So here's an example of how to do a signal phrase, and one thing to keep in mind when it comes to APA is that the author's name and year should always be touching, okay? So they should always be adjacent, they should always be side by side, regardless of whether you're using a signal phrase like this one, or you're saving it to the end of the sentence and using a parenthetical reference that way. But what you'll notice here is that because we have this direct quote, we also need our page number at the end. And this is one of the things that's a little bit different about APA as opposed to MLA or another style that you might have used, which is that the author and year information, or the initial information, is actually separated from the page number. It's one of the things that a lot of people have trouble with in transitioning to APA. But you just want to make sure that whenever there is a direct quote, you reserve that page number for the end. So like I said, it may seem like small details, but just being familiar with the rules, recognizing a lot of what I do when I work with students on their APA style, I can pick out just by looking at the page. I don't have to go down and break everything down element by element. A lot of it's, how it appears on the page. I can determine whether or not the student really knows what they're doing. And when we talk about the references page especially, I can tell if a student is using APA or if they've used an online citation generator or Microsoft Word, which I would really encourage you not to do because they're not consistent and they're not standardized. So you may feel like you're taking a shortcut, but honestly, when students come in and they bring me the Microsoft Word version, I spend more time trying to figure out what each piece is and kind of put it back into the format, sort of like rebuilding Humpty Dumpty. It takes a lot more time and effort to do it that way than if you had just gone through the steps and at least made an attempt this way, doing it sort of manually in advance. So what you can see is that then it joins up with that page number. And again, anytime you have those elements together, they need to be separated by a comma. That's a big thing that sets APA apart from other styles. MLA, you just use the author's last name and the page number with no commas or no additional punctuation within that parenthetical reference. APA wants each element to have sort of its own respective space, which is offset by commas. So those are our signal phrase options. Now, here is an example of if you have someone with a common surname. So say you have a Smith or a Jones or a Thomas, somebody that has a really common last name, you may have to add their initials into that in-text citation just to distinguish between one Smith and the other. Now you don't do that every time, only when you have authors with the same last name. Also, when you have multiple authors, there is sort of a separate rule. If you're using a signal phrase, you spell out the word and, whereas when you get to your in-text citation or your parenthetical reference, you need to use the and symbol. Again, really fine-tuning details, sort of things that if you're not sure about, it's much better to ask. I'm here 42 hours a week, always feel free to stop by my desk if you see me sitting there and you're not sure that you did it right. Please ask me. It's better to get that clarified than to lose points for it. So again, you'll see that a lot of the elements are the same. You still have your year, you still have your page number, but the differences are how you distinguish between an and or multiple authors in the signal phrase and in the parenthetical reference. So some other things. We talked a little bit before about an organization where it may be hard to find who the specific author is. And so what we have in many cases is what's considered a corporate author or an organization that publishes on behalf of itself. So think about an organization like the CDC, okay? So it's a very reliable, it's a very reputable source, especially if you're looking for current things on Ebola or different epidemics. It may be a really good source to use in a paper, but speaking from experience, I have two friends who both work for the CDC. They write the articles, but they write them as part of a team, and ultimately they're published by the organization, and my friends' names are excluded because they worked as part of that team and they're representing that whole organization. So what you would want to do if you have a lengthy corporate author like the American Psychological Association, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, is that you want to spell it out always on first reference. Anytime you use an abbreviation, always spell it out so that it's as clear as possible, but then use this bracket format to put in whatever type of abbreviation you're going to use for that particular term. On all second and subsequent references, you can just use the abbreviation then. It'll save you space, it'll save you headaches. It's one of the few shortcuts that APA puts in place to really help you out. Now, another place where you can take a little bit of a shortcut with APA that maybe you can't in other sources is through the use of what's called et, or it means as previously stated. Now you will see that I have an extra period in here that's not supposed to be there. It's one of those things that I need to revise myself. But if you have four or more authors, okay, on second reference, you can put this ETAL period to basically refer to the fact that all of those other authors have previously been listed. Again, it's sort of a first reference thing. First reference all spelled out, second reference abbreviated or shortened, okay? So that's what you want to be looking for on your subsequent references. Those are some kind of shortcuts or some time-saving devices that you can use. So if you're overwhelmed, please take advantage of all of the resources that you have available to you. You have your print resources like your little seagull, you have the Purdue OWL, you have the opportunity to work one-on-one with me, or even don't be afraid to stop in and ask your professors if you have any confusion that's coming up with APA. Ultimately, what I found is a lot of professors like APA, but they may have some specific things that they wanted. For example, the crim department on campus doesn't want the DOI or a retrieve from URL when using campus databases. So these are sort of individual rules based on departments. So you may want to just check with me or check with your department to make sure that you're doing it according to what they're looking for, because sometimes they don't need all of the elements that APA is requiring, but they want sort of that standard format. So don't hesitate to drop in. I have regular hours every day from 8:30 to 5 and drop-in hours from 5 to 7, which is no appointment necessary. You just stop by and it's sort of on a first come, first served basis. So do you guys have any questions about that? About anything that we've covered so far, from kind of a standard formatting, a basic in-text aspect of APA? Okay, so what I want to do now is move on to the references, and then once we do that, I'm going to go through and give you guys an opportunity to use some of the resources that we have to try and properly document your sources. Oops. Okay, so when it comes to reference pages, there are certain things that you're going to need in each entry. You're going to need some basics like your author, your date, your titles, and your publication place and publisher. Now keep in mind that when all research projects or research papers were started, initially what was your only resource? Before we had the internet, before we had journals, before we had newspapers, what were you using to write a paper? Books, okay? So everything that we're going to talk about sort of spirals out from the simple book format, and you may have to make a few tweaks or adjustments, but a lot of the elements are going to be the same. So if you can feel pretty comfortable with the book format, you can sort of figure out where those adjustments need to be made with other formats. So these are the main things that you need: your authors, dates, titles, and your publication information. The other thing to keep in mind is that when you do your references, you're going to want to have your page alphabetized by author last name. Now, one of the mistakes that I've seen students make is they get a little bit over obsessed with this idea of alphabetization, and so what they'll do is they'll actually rearrange the authors within an individual text, and that's a big no-no. Why do you think an author's name is listed first on an article? What does it signify?
Work.
Right, they did the most work. They're the lead author. So if you've ever heard that expression, so-and-so is the lead author on this article, it means that they did the bulk of the work, and actually those names are listed in terms of the level of contribution that they made. So you don't want to diminish somebody's contribution to a particular article by rearranging or re-alphabetizing within an article, but you do want your reference page to be arranged alphabetically by author's last name, and that's whoever is listed first in that grouping. Okay, so the single author format. I will admit there are some limitations to this Prezi software. Prezi's great, there are a lot of advantages to it, but when I created this one, it was before you were able to use italics, and so you'll see that that is marked. ITL there is there just to remind you that that should be italicized. So with this single book format, what you're going to see is, and this is how I can usually tell somebody doesn't know what they're doing with APA or that they've used an automatic generator. It should be author's last name, comma, initials. So if they have one initial, include it. If they have 6 first initials, include all 6. Make sure that they're separated by period. So it should be initial, period, and if we have multiple authors, we'll take a look at how to make those adjustments as well. The next thing, again, just as if you were citing in the text, author and year are always side by side, okay? And so the common mistake I see is that a lot of students will say, oh, well, the article was published March 31st, 2014. Most professors don't care what the actual month and day were, they just want to know the year. Why do you think it's important to know the year of a source that's being used? Why do you think it's important to know the year? What do you think?
So it's still relevant, like today.
Okay, so you said you're in health sciences. What's a relevant window for a particular source?
Probably
Okay, yeah, that's exactly right. 3 to 5 years, depending on whether you're a nursing, rad. Each department sort of has its own specification. If you're in some other fields, some places accept as much as 10 years, whereas if you go all the way to something like literature or history, you're probably going to be, first of all, using a different style, but your window is also much larger because the resources don't need to be as current. But if you're in the health sciences, if you're in business, you're going to want the most current sources, and so that's why it's so important to have that year indicated there. The next thing that you'll notice here when we look at this title is that not all of it's capitalized. Okay? It will be italicized for the title of a book, which we can't see, but you'll notice that only the first letter of the title and any subtitle are capitalized. Everything else, unless it's a proper noun, is going to appear lowercase. It's one of those things that APA does that, again, catch people off guard. So within these first 3 elements, I can usually figure out whether or not somebody knows what they're doing with APA or whether or not they really know the rules, because those things are so unique to APA style. Now the next thing that you'll see is basic publisher's information, city, comma, initials of the state, and then the publisher. It's very basic, it's very simple. It's one of those things that the more you practice it, the more you're able to pick it out. I always keep this book on my desk as a resource, but I can tell you for the most part, I've actually, even though I have an English degree, I'm much stronger now at APA because I use it every day, because so many departments use it every day, that for the most part I don't have to look up, the basic formats, books, journals, websites. I know those off the top of my head because I've seen them so many times and I know where everything's supposed to be. So what you'll find is that the more you use it, the more comfortable you'll be with it. So with multiple authors, you're going to follow the same format, but the authors' names are going to be separated by commas. And again, like we did with our in-text citations, we're going to use that ampersand or that and symbol as opposed to spelling out the word and. And so you would need to know not only who the original author was, but who the editor is. And so a lot of books, a lot of good resources that you find are gathered together by an editor and they're put into one location to simplify things for you. So I always include this example for that reason. We still include our regular author's name and initials at the front. We include the year of the edited edition as opposed to the year of the original. Okay? So we'll have our year of the edited edition, the title, and then we'll include our editor's name with this ED period at the end to signify what it is that they did. Now, one thing that you'll notice that's a little bit different is that here we have last name, comma, first initials, and once we get to the editor, it becomes first initial, last name. Basically, once you get past that author at the beginning, everything goes back into regular format, so the way that you would see it if it were written out linearly. A lot of the same things still have our year and our publisher, and one thing that is unique to edited collections is that you also include the dates of the original works at the end, okay? Unless they're not available. But again, this is something very unique to APA, so knowing the rules, or at least knowing where to find the rules and how to implement them, is going to be really important because there's so many things that may be uncomfortable or unfamiliar if you're coming from a different style. Now, the model that we have here is your basic journal, and what I'd like to do instead is, I think I have the one that is the online version because for the most part that's what you're going to use, so that's the one I want to focus our time and effort on. But the real difference is that everything is the same up to this last part, which is the DOI, or retrieve from information, but that makes it clear that it's a web resource, that it's from a database, as opposed to, a print journal like this one or like one of these, okay? So, when it comes to citing this, a lot of similar things. We still have our authors and our initials. We still have our year. Now what you'll see here is that the title of the article is now going to be written in regular font, standard font. It's no longer italicized, and the reason for that is we want to be able to differentiate between the title of the article as opposed to the title of the journal that it came from. So the journal itself will be italicized, and that will also include the volume number. So when I work with students, one of the things that I do is I'll actually use a squiggly underline to indicate wherever there needs to be italics. because a lot of times they'll do the title of the journal, but they'll forget the volume number. And according to APA, that's another one of those sort of quirks that you just need to be aware of. It's not a rule that, you know, it's not something that's intuitive, it's not something you're just going to know by looking at it, it's something that comes from practice and familiarity. But what you'll notice here with this journal article is that you also include a page range, because it typically starts on one page and ends later on in that same journal, and so you want to show where it was published. Now, what do you think is one of the limits with using our database? What do you think might be one of the limits, especially when it comes to pages? Where might you have trouble finding your pages?
If it's not a PDF of the actual.
Exactly. So if you're using a source and it's in the HTML format, that's where it's like one big block of text. It just keeps going on and you can keep scrolling, right? So you're not able to see the original page number. So even if you have to directly quote, it's going to be very difficult to cite it appropriately and to give the page number where you need to. So one of the rules to keep in mind is if something's not available, you can't include something that doesn't exist, you exclude that. But if ever possible and if available to you, please use the PDF format, because it gives you the advantage of seeing the page numbers and of breaking things down. So that when you need to cite something in text, it makes it much easier to be as specific as possible. Now the last thing here is the one where a lot of people really struggle. It's what's called a DOI, or a digital object identifier. Who can tell me what that is or what it should look like? You guys know?
The website itself, just a URL, is that what you're?
No, actually a DOI, it kind of takes the place of the URL. It's supposed to be more stable. So have you ever gone to a website and you see error 404, this site does not exist anymore? This kind of helps prevent that from happening, but it happens within databases. So they come up with a number that, even if you don't know the title of the article, theoretically you should be able to type that number in and it takes you directly to the article. So it's something that's there to be a little bit more expedient than your traditional URL, and it's there to be a little bit more stable. So you're not going to lose that website or lose that version of the article. The DOI gets you there faster. Now in the event though that whatever database you're using doesn't employ that format, that DOI or that digital object identifier, you can always go back to the retrieved from and then copy and paste the URL in there. One thing that you would want to do is between the word retrieved and from, you're going to want to put the date that you actually accessed it. So today's would be what? Retrieved from, or retrieved February 17th, 2015, from, and then you put your URL address in there. Okay? So it's there so that they can figure out not only what source you used, but when you got it and how you got it.